I'm in a little bit of a mood. The heat doesn't agree with me. I haven't been getting a lot of quality sleep. So let's just find something fucking retarded and rip on it for a bit. Sound good? Well, that'll do nicely, I guess. Okay, first let's establish my bona fides. I am a professional game designer. I have been for nearly 20 years. I was heavily involved in the Camarilla, which was the vampire LARP society that was international. Met my partner through it. Was involved nationally, internationally, was a storyteller on the national stage for Mage, amongst other things. Played Vampire pretty much the day it came out in this country, having read it on the train and played it that afternoon and evening. Loved it. Part of the reason I dress like a pound shop Rob Zombie is because meeting the people behind Vampire was such a disappointment. You would expect people behind such a game to be really, cool dudes. A couple of them were, but most of them were just your regular Joe Schlubs or coked up to the eyeballs. Justin Achille, I'm looking at you, or dicks. Jess Heinig being the major one there. I know Vampire, I know Storyteller, I know White Wolf, I know the gaming industry. I also write. I've written horror. I've had short stories included in horror collections and stuff. So basically what I'm telling you is not that I'm an authority per se, but that I know about all this shit going into it. Right. What are you then?
Originally born in Glasgow, the Dice Dog lives on the south coast of England with a collection of pet rats. He is the author of 2 best-selling novels, a collection of horror stories, Hush, a horror anthology, and the young adult coming-of-age comedy Diary of a Gay Teenage Zombie. His first book, a collection of some of his earliest dark fantasy and horror tales, reached the Amazon bestseller charts, and has contributed to several anthology works. He has given performances at Halloween celebrations and book month events across the south coast. His newest series of books, Tales of Monsterotica, a series of homoerotic horror comedies, is available now by Deep Desires Press. His literary influences include Neil Gaiman and Clive Barker. He grew up reading the fighting fantasy choose-your-own-adventure game books and ran the popular blog site Fighting for Your Fantasy. His hobbies include alternative cinema, comic books, screaming at clouds, and tabletop roleplay games, of which he plays and runs regularly. He's the manager of his city's roleplay guild, the city's longest-running community of fans of RPGs. He can and will also run for you a mean game of Call of Cthulhu, if you ask him.
So a little bit of nosing around, and what we uncover is that the Dice Dog is a gay furry. Now, you do you, mate. Your kink is not my kink, but knock yourself out. I'm just saying you're not exactly smashing any stereotypes coming at Vampire with this social justice warrior claptrap cancer and being a gay furry. It's not exactly smashing through any stereotypes, breaking any tropes, or frankly surprising anybody. Kudos for their bad titles though, like Wankenstein and Castle of Shagula I think was another one. Anyway, moving swiftly on.
This will be a contentious series of articles. Even before they've been published, before one word of them has been made public, I received comments from people condemning them as SJW cancer and a host of other buzzwords. This article may be attacked, my website may be hit, I may receive a flood of negative attention and threats. I will discuss that form of reaction to these articles in due course at a later date.
It is quite impressive when someone calls out harassment they haven't even received yet as an attempt to try and stave off criticism before it even happens. I mean, the playbook that we're familiar with these days is that you do something stupid or make something awful or shit on something that people love, then people get upset, then you say that all the reaction and criticism and upset is harassment, and that's how you deflect it. That's how this normally goes. So preemptively doing that is a little bit new. It reminds me of arguing with creationists. So many of these arguments remind me of arguing with creationists. But they have this idea of prophecy being fulfilled in the Bible, because supposedly in the Bible and in other religious texts, it must be said for other religions, it says that, you know, your prophet or whoever knew that people would be poo-pooing and speaking out against what they said, and that's taken as proof that they have prophetic powers, or that what they say is truth. You know, if I say grass is orange, you may hear many people in the future telling you that it is green, but I tell you it is orange, and I speak to you that these people who come forth and tell you it is green, these people are deluded and defective, and so on. It just doesn't work, really. I mean, there's an obvious problem there. If you say something that is obvious horseshit, but call out people preemptively on the fact that they're going to call you out on it being horseshit, you know, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that what you're saying is any less stupid or retarded than it actually is. Alright, let's establish a few ground rules then, since you're going to take anything as harassment. I'm not harassing you, I am making fun of you. I think what you're claiming in this series of articles, this epic poem you've apparently written, casting aspersions about the White Wolf and vampire and the new owners and everything else, I think it's bollocks. And I think it's so egregiously stupid that I'm largely going to spend my time making fun of you for it. Because ridicule is the only weapon that may be used against unintelligible propositions, as Jefferson once said. But, okay, I gave my background, but let's also establish a few things here. Right, we're talking about Vampire. It's a horror game. It's a horror game intended for a mature audience, people who can tackle and understand difficult topics, horrific scenarios, all that kind of thing. It's meant for adults. Now, I know the stereotype is the trenchcoat katana player. You can't control who plays your game or how they play it once it's out in the wild. That's nobody's fault. But it had pretensions of being something more. And it also drew on a wide variety of vampiric fiction and ideas, everything from Necroscope through to Blade, back to Carmilla and Bram Stoker's Dracula, obviously. And a lot of vampiric fiction is using vampires allegorically. So, to take Dracula as the most obvious example, I mean, there's xenophobia there, fear of the foreign, fear of the different. There's an arrogance and nobility to Dracula in that. So there's it riffs off bloodlines and aristocracy and all the rest of that. And it's also an allegorical and metaphorical way of talking about rape, and of talking about the way in which the Victorians sublimated and covered over their sexuality, which was bubbling away quite nicely beneath the surface. So there's all of these aspects to vampiric fiction as well, and it's been very effective as allegory, as a way of discussing difficult topics without going at them directly. In much the same way, and this will become relevant later perhaps, that the X-Men in comics were used as an allegory for racism and other marginalization of groups. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. A mature horror game intended for mature people to deal with horrific situations, and with a long tradition in many different forms of being allegorical and metaphorical. Great.
White Wolf is no stranger to courting controversy. In the 1990s, the media headlines surrounding Rod Ferrell, a member of a so-called vampire cult in Kentucky, forced the fledgling company to publish a statement defending itself when their popular tabletop RPG, Vampire the Masquerade, was named as a heavy influence on Rod Ferrell's lifestyle and beliefs.
Our friend here goes on for a while in this vein, pardon the pun, and what's ironic here is he is essentially victim blaming, and I think that this is where I fundamentally part with this guy. So he blames, or appears to blame, certainly from the way he's written the article, he appears to blame the way Vampire is written, the nature of the stories, particularly the nature of the Sabbats, which is a faction in Vampire. He seems to blame that for the connection to Feral, missing out on a couple of rather fundamental and important things. Firstly, this is fiction. The Vampire RPG is no more responsible for Feral being a fucking mentalist than this guy's cheesy monster erotica is responsible for turning people gay. There's no relation between the two whatsoever. People tend to be attracted to things that scratch their itches, but that doesn't mean that those things turn people into monsters. Indeed, what little evidence we do have suggests that, for example, violent pornography provides an outlet for people who might otherwise be rapists or be more likely to be rapists. It's even more controversial when you look into things like child pornography and the role that fictionalized, unreal child pornography and even sex dolls, I mean, even just saying that feels disgusting, but it might help stop people acting on their urges, which is a good thing. We have to put our personal distaste aside. But there's this wall between art and crazy mentalists who go off on one about it. You know, that's on them. And I went through all this in the Satanic Panic, and then we went through it with Jack Thompson, we went through it with Vampire as well, and what we're going through currently with people like this blogger, this gay furry blogger, who should know better than to respond to or buy into moral panics, we're suffering a moral panic on that basis, on pseudo-feminism, and the idea that everything is racist and sexist and horrible and whatever the fuck else. It's another moral panic, just like Pat Pulling, just like Jack Thompson, just like this mini vampire panic. And he appears to blame the victim, thinking that the makers of Vampire are the people who should have changed what they did or reined in their fiction or made it different. And somehow that would prevent Rod Ferrell being a fucking mentalist. Which it wouldn't. And this is where I think the disconnect is between the two of us. He is victim blaming. He is blaming the art for creating the monster. I mean, furries have a reputation for yiffing and an interest in bestiality and so on. So should I criticize your monster erotica or your clear fursona for misleading people and leading people into bestiality? Hopefully, obviously, you can see that because it relates to you personally as being completely absurd. And you can understand why you might be insulted if people constantly called you, you know, a poodle pervert. Or whatever else, you know? So maybe that will help you empathize with and understand why people like me just give the two-fingered salute to any suggestion that fiction, that media, that games, you know, turn people into Satanists, misogynists, vampires, murderers, suicidal, whatever else it might be. Because all the evidence we have suggests that it's not true, and you appear to be blaming Vampire, weirdly. And you don't seem to understand the Sabbat either. They weren't necessarily so much supremacists as that they were by any means necessary to combat the antediluvians, the ancient vampires that were going to awake and devour them all. Who does by any means necessary sound like? And what about their communal blood bonds, the Vaulderie, where they basically mildly enslaved themselves to each other into one big happy commune? It's not sounding particularly fascist to me. The Camarilla, on the other hand, with their monarchy and their absolute laws, their justicars and their archons, enforcing those laws in that strict hierarchy, that sounds a little more fascistic, especially given their hidebound respect to tradition and the elders.
terms of presentation, the game focused heavily on the aspect of the curse. Vampires were who they were not because they were blessed, but because they were cursed by God. Their immortality was a judgment, a damnation. The game's cover, with a single solitary ankh necklace, captured the idea of the question of life. What was the purpose and meaning of life? If it were eternal and without end, what pushes us to achieve our goals, if not the threat of the end of life coming towards us? And as predators, are we truly above the lives that we take? It was imperative from a marketing and an intellectual level that vampires should be framed as damned creatures, that the curse could not be forgotten. If the game had chosen to make the idea of being a vampire too palatable, too thrilling, too sexual, without that balance to remind you that you were playing a monster, then it would be little more than playing a game of racial superiority, of people who were preternaturally phenomenal because of their bloodlines. So White Wolf chose wisely not to overly sexualize the vampires, not too much, and especially not on the covers of their rulebooks, just to be certain that, oh.
Always harping on there is that the new cover is more sexualized, but sex has always been part of Vampire. Carmilla, Vampiros Lesbos, Bram Stoker's Dracula, all of it. There's always been, at least post-Dracula, maybe a little bit before, there's always been this sexual element to it. And you've got to remember that Vampire was coming out off the back of a lot of influence from the Vampire Lestat and all the rest of Anne Rice's vampire novels, and she was basically a softcore erotica writer for much of her career and much of her work. That's how it went. So the sex has always been there, and it wasn't absent from White Wolf's books at all. Even in the first edition softback cover version, there were sexual pictures, there were nipples. This was a mature game after all. I seem to recall the first Bruja clan book had a prostitute as one of the character stereotypes in the back, a pick up and play pre-generated character, which rather deliciously someone at our local LARP decided to adopt as their character as they began to play, and they dressed the part, and boy were we happy for that fact. There was also, as I recall, a skinhead as one of the first Bruja playable characters in the clan book. So, this stuff goes almost right the way back to the beginning, and I think there was an understanding amongst this generation of creators that fiction and reality were separated. There wasn't this concern you seem to have that having something in fiction, whether allegorically or otherwise, reflects on reality. I have played some atrocious villains in some games, an Abyssal Exalted in particular, because it's interesting to try and understand that headspace and those motivations and so on. And that's one of the beauties of role-playing, to step into someone else's shoes, to understand, or to not necessarily to understand, but to try and grasp and tackle their motivations and why they feel as they do. And these things that you seem to have a problem with in Vampire, these are key themes of supremacy and wish fulfillment, and would we become monsters with all of this power that we have, with the blood bond and creating neonate vampires from your bloodline as servants and so on. There's also questions of slavery. These are all big, interesting, ethical questions that it also exist alongside the wish fulfillment of the katana trenchcoat hurling cars around undead superheroes. That influence, that style of play is as valid as any other. All you're doing is parading your own personal hang-ups and interpretations. That's all. You're not passing judgment on the game, you're just revealing your own idiosyncrasies.
So yeah, when White Wolf, hereafter referred to by their more accurate name, a bunch of Swedish edgelords, were reformed in 2016 with an entirely new development team, a whole new purpose, and an intent to set out and recreate the smash hit of Vampire the Masquerade for a younger audience, they had their work cut out for them. After all, a whole new generation had grown up in that time. When they announced that they would be making a 5th edition of the game, a lot of people were very excited. When they announced their intention to continue the game after the Gehenna event, a global apocalypse that ended the original Vampire the Masquerade series entirely, a lot of people were very confused. It soon became obvious that a bunch of Swedish edgelords We're aiming to essentially redevelop much of this game's setting, and that's understandable. After all, by taking the game ahead in time by about 10 years, which due to the passage of real-world time is essentially what has happened, they had very much a blank slate on which they could write their own game. What kind of setting would they create? Well, first of all, before we discuss that, we need to talk about Nazis.
No, we don't, you wolf-wanking worrywart, because it's got fuck all to do with anything. Nazis are a fringe of a fringe of a fringe, and calling everything and everyone a Nazi is, once again, retarded. And I say this as a far-left anarchist agitator who always used to play an anarch. Why did I play an anarch? Because it was fun. I like the self-sufficiency and personal individual power that is present in Vampire the game as a character, and you had a genuine global conspiracy of the man holding everyone down to fight. I understand the appeal for conspiracy theorists, and it's fun as a fantasy, it's just not real, but it helps me understand why people fall for people like Alex Jones. But we're not going to talk about Nazis, because it's pointless. We're going to skip to the end.
Now I know what you're thinking, perhaps this is just reading too much into it, maybe I'm simply seeing more to this than what is actually there. You're right, we shouldn't look at the setting and the dubious front cover alone, surely the gameplay itself is what will define the playing experience. Thankfully, a bunch of Swedish edgelords, I really need to abbreviate that, had me covered, for you see they released an alpha playtest. I downloaded this on the first day, keen to see what the PDF contained. How would they update the system and bring the game into the 21st century? Well, it streamlined the attribute skills by like a lot, as in there was almost nothing left of them. It was railroady, very railroady. It had a new system intended to measure your character's hunger, which was fun, if you enjoy keeping track of individual numbers. But the core idea was there, so how did this new hunger system's micromanagement interact with the game's morality and humanity systems? Yes, good question. How was humanity the core focus of the game that prevented your character from becoming a truly unrepentant monster? Well, I don't know, the alpha didn't actually have it. But that's okay, right? I mean, without the confines of, morals, you were free to roleplay any kind of character that you wanted. It was open like that, a wonderful blank canvas for you to do what you wanted, without the constraint of simple, lowly human morals. After all, you're a vampire now, you're better than that. You can play your character however you want, so grab your character sheets, which the game has pre-generated for your convenience, get ready to get stuck in, and realise that one of the characters is a paedophile. Wait, what?
If you're unfamiliar with Scandinavian role-playing ideas, conventions, in the sense of the way they go about things, I can understand why that would seem like edgelord behaviour. Personally, I think it's quite interesting to juxtapose the vampire as monster with the paedophile as monster. But anyway, Scandinavian games, especially LARPs, which this seems to be more tailored towards, have a reputation for dealing with difficult subjects, interesting subjects. Personally, I find them a bit pretentious. Go and look up Jeep forms and similar things like that. But there is this tradition of that kind of pretentious roleplay, of that examination of deep topics. So when you call them Swedish edgelords, that doesn't really jibe with what I know about Scandinavian role-playing traditions and techniques and emphasis. It far more seems to me that they are trying to be deep and meaningful and to have nuance and all the rest of it, and either they're failing or you're failing at comprehension. And given the rest of the content of this article, I'm going to go with the latter.
In 2017, Charlottesville in Virginia was thrown into international headlines due to a controversial Unite the Right rally. During the events of that rally, a multitude of people descended on the town, which culminated in a torchlit march during which many chanted the phrase "Jews will not replace us" and the 1940s German Nazi slogan "Blood and Soil." Throughout the day, many Nazi swastika flags were caught on video being held, carried and worn, as were US Confederate flags, Gadsden flags, and a new addition to the ranks of neo-Nazi iconography, Kekistani flags. This particular flag grew out of popular internet online memes and has been co-opted by the far right, similar to the co-opting of the online meme Pepe the Frog, hence its inclusion at this and similar events.
There is simply no nice way to put this. You're a fucking idiot. having the Kekistani flag or whatever at a Nazi event is a huge self-own on the part of the Nazis, because the whole point of Kekistan is to make fun of and to satirize identity politics, whether they exist on the right in the form of nationalism and racist ideologies, or whether they stem from the pseudo-left with other racist ideologies, or the idea that your inalienable traits, things that cannot be changed, such as your sexuality, your race, what gender you identify as, should be the most important thing ever. Whereas the whole idea in the past used to be to get over these kind of obsessions, and the Kekistani flag, I think, grows out of that sentiment that identity matters not two tugs of a dead dog's cock, and what matters is the content of what you're saying, and so on. The only people making Pepe or Kekistan right-wing or fascistic are people like you, overreacting to it and basically handing it to them on a platter, when you could be and should be using it to take the piss out of right-wing identity politics. But you can't, because that would mean also admitting that left-wing identity politics is also a huge steaming crock of runny shit.
That's not to say that early White Wolf had nothing genuinely mature in their work. They certainly came over time to realise that content warnings were not simply preferable, but a means of showing respect for your audience. When early White Wolf decided to put out a product that was liable to be truly controversial, it was published under their Black Dog imprint. Most of the books published for it were puerile rubbish, but one book, Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, was a respectful and historically well-researched book, a rarity for White Wolf at any time, and a look at the horrors of Germany's concentration camps. The term Shoah is a Jewish term for the Holocaust, and perhaps unsurprisingly, a modern online neo-Nazi podcast is infamously called The Daily Shoah. When asked if they would have considered a content warning for their alpha release, a bunch of Swedish edgelords mocked the idea of content warnings at all. Naturally, it will come as no surprise to many of you that modern neo-Nazis also despise the concept of content warnings.
For every charnel Houses of Europe, there was a Gypsies, which was insensitive, and they got in a lot of trouble for racism about that one. By the way, it's charnel Houses of Europe, not carnal, as you put. You pervy little schnauzer stupper, you. But anyway, the point is, yes, it was the more shocking material, the more risque material, and it was also an in-house joke, because White Wolf Games was in their setting as Black Dog Game Factory, which was a subsidiary of Pentex, which was the big corporate cartoonish villain in Werewolf the Apocalypse. So, you know, there's that. But the point is, they tackled these difficult subjects, and you seem to be giving a pass to charnel Houses of Europe that you won't give to the new gamers. Now, the more you describe these Swedish edgelords, the more they sound like disenchanted and disenfranchised Gen Xers like me, who find these things that you seem to lionize and hold as high standards, like content warnings, as being undue artistic interference. Now, I have no problem with a very generalized content warning, like an age rating, you know, U, PG, 12, 15, 18, X, you know, that's fine. That gives you a broad general idea of what you're getting into when you go to a movie or buy a computer game, you know, that's fine. But the kind of specific warnings of material that might be included in a film or whatever that you and others like you seem to be asking for, these aren't content warnings so much as spoilers. When I disparage things like X cards, I point out that it's like giving everyone in the cinema a stop button. You know, if you go into a horror movie that's rated 18, you have a general idea of the kind of stuff that's going to appear. And for one person to wreck it for everybody else just because they are triggered doesn't seem to be a good way to go about things, to me. Generalized content warnings, great. Specific content warnings, like the type you seem to be asking for, like trigger warnings, they're horseshit. They don't do any good. They may be doing more harm than good, because they're preventing people from interacting safely with things that upset them, thereby inuring them and helping them to get over it. you're causing more problems, far more problems than you're even potentially solving when you act like this. And it's not just the far right that has a problem with trigger warnings and other nonsense like that. As a creator, as an artist, as a writer, as a maker of games, I object to them because they give too much away. And trying to fit into these different bubbles is often difficult and constricting, and not in a good way that the limitations that you place upon yourself can be.
But personally, the single most mature and boundary-pushing thing that Old White Wolf ever did, if we want to look at things that actually had a real impact on the gaming hobby as a whole, was to not presume a masculine gender when discussing the player's character.
Jesus Christ, this pisses me off more than it probably should, and it betrays an absolute lack of understanding of the English language, of the history of the English language, of pronouns in English. Is just... oh! And it has made so many role-playing books jarring and difficult to read because they swap back and forth between genders, or they use the female gender pronoun exclusively. It's just... oh, right. It doesn't help that everyone's so fucking ignorant of this, because that makes it seem like they've got a point when they don't. And God, it has made submitting freelance work for RPG companies a fucking nightmare, because everyone has a different fucking pronoun policy.
In February 2017, the first Vampire the Masquerade mobile phone app was released, titled We Eat Blood and All Our Friends Are Dead. No, really. Oh jeez, I'm gonna need a drink to continue with this. Really? That's your title? Can we just, like, not? Fuck my life. Well, this app was primarily written by Zach Sabbath and Sarah Horrocks, and we kinda need to talk about Zach S. Like, we need to talk about him a lot. Zach rose to infamy in the gaming community due to his behaviour that he undertook as part of the Gamergate movement. For those unfamiliar, Gamergate was an online movement that was used primarily as a reactionary response to growing critical analysis in the gaming medium, often by female voices.
Zach had nothing to do with Gamergate whatsoever. In fact, I think if anything, he came out against it. I seem to recall that being the case. He is a fairly ardent feminist, but much more of a second wave feminist. He's a talented guy. He just is fixated upon defending himself and other people from spurious accusations. And given that a lot of what goes on these days, including in this blog post, are spurious accusations, he can seem much more combative and nasty than he is. Zach doesn't talk to me anymore, but I don't bear him any ill will. I think he's a very talented chap who does very good stuff. I think him and D&D with Porn Stars and all the work that he's done for Lamentations of the Flame Princess and everything, I think him and his little posse have been a massively positive force in gaming. As to Gamergate itself, Gamergate was a movement against censorship, against the politicization, or rather the overt politicization of the gaming space, and a demand for ethical games journalism. That means, you know, if you're fucking somebody, you should probably disclose that in any articles you do discussing or recommending or talking up their games. You know, basic journalistic stuff. If you want to know more about Gamergate, hop on over to my playlists where I read out the book that I researched and wrote about Gamergate. Or even better, hop on over to Amazon and buy a copy of Inside Gamergate. Now, when you say this kind of thing about Gamergate and about Zach, it calls even more into question everything that you say everywhere else in this article, because if you can't get even these basic fundamental little things right, then what chance have you got of getting the more complex and difficult things right? Stick to pushing boundaries with border collies, mate.
Blah blah dog whistle, blah 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 blah, neo-Nazi claiming to be alt-right, blah blah, basement dweller, blah, downloading movies, blah blah, incels, blah blah, disenfranchised white man. Blah 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 blah. Blah blah left extremism, blah right extremism, blah 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 blah. Play this instead, play that instead. Ooh, play Call of Cthulhu.
It's hard to fathom how someone presumably of similar age to me can be such a mewling quim about all of this stuff, how they can be so hypersensitive. I mean, Gen X, we had a kind of cool detachment from things. If, as you say, you think this appeals to disenfranchised white men who are dangerous because they feel disenfranchised, and I don't accept any of the premises or parts of that argument whatsoever, but let's just do a little thought experiment here. If they're dangerous because they're disenfranchised, how will disenfranchising them further from things that they love and enjoy help? I don't think that it would, even in this hypothetical situation. In that hypothetical situation, you would want to keep open lines of communication and games and media and so on to make them feel included and a part of society, and perhaps to let some of your ideas rub off on them, not to propagandize, but just through allegory and metaphor and so forth to get across to them. I don't think you understand the full creative import of what you're suggesting, that nobody can ever tackle a difficult subject unless they meet your unlisted, unseen criteria. You seem to think Shoah is okay, but other things aren't. You know, these things directly tackle these kinds of problems and subjects, and you'll give it a pass on some kind of subjective, personal level, but not on anything anyone can actually put a finger on, so they can know how to do it again, you know? And that's not an acceptable way upon which to determine what can and cannot be discussed or played or represented, because it's too subjective. I would put the emphasis on us as the consumers to make the decision. This is for me, this isn't for me. And if something isn't for me, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a right to exist, or it can't serve an audience that does exist. And I don't think everyone who disagrees with you is a Nazi, which is what you seem to be implying. I am a far-left anarchist. I massively disagree with the authoritarian and censorious nature of social justice warriors, the regressive left, whatever you want to call them. I also disagree with the authoritarian and censorious nature of the right. It's the authoritarianism and the attempt to dictate art and leisure and so on. These are the things I object to. And there is an ultimate irony right at the very end of your moronic article, in that you recommend Call of Cthulhu. Everyone knows H.P. Lovecraft was a virulent racist. Now, I would argue that some of his work is so good because he was such a virulent racist. He had such a fear of the different and the other, and any culture outside his own little narrow perspective. That fear, that skin-crawling horror at the other that he felt comes through in his work, and it's a big part of what has made it so timeless and effective. And if he hadn't been such a bigot, I don't think his work would have been as good as it is. In the same way that I think the kind of virulently overreaching aspects of feminism that have informed things like The Handmaid's Tale, don't think that would be as effective without that extreme ideology. But there is a problem when you set out to propagandize to people. I don't think Lovecraft was setting out to make people racist. I don't think writers of a lot of more successful fiction that deals in these subjects, I don't think they've set out to propagandize. Where we have a problem, where things start to fall down, where things start to fall apart, where get woke, go broke becomes meaningful is when people try to propagandize, when they entryist into an arena, whether it be role-playing games or video games or science fiction or comics or whatever else, in order to propagandize, rather than to tell good stories and their own perceptions and stuff coming through in allegory and metaphor and just in the way that they write. If they're setting out to propagandize, to brainwash, that's where the quality starts to drop off. You're just a fucking idiot who doesn't know at all what they're talking about, or somehow slept under a rock for 25 years. If this game is going to appeal to anybody, I think it's going to appeal to disenchanted Gen Xers like myself, and people who have just had enough of censorious, authoritarian bullshit from whatever side you care to mention. Now, the mark of a mature mind is the ability to entertain ideas without believing them, and roleplay is a big part of that. Representation is the wrong hill to die on here, and wanting to censor and control what was a landmark mature role-playing game in this way is frankly childish, and you can get fucked, but preferably not by a corgi. Zang.